we'll start off. We start off with maybe the trickiest one of them all. That just happened to be the order I wrote the questions in. Initially, a bank has $200 in assets, $150 in liabilities, and $50 in owner's equity. It then sees one of its investments increase in value by $20, increasing the value of its assets to $220. The bank wishes to maintain a 4-to-1 leverage ratio. What do we expect to happen? All right, so the answer here is A. So the bank is going to take out $60 in loans. Let's see why. There we go. All right. So let's go ahead. I'll start off, and using the black, I'll sort of set up the problem in its initial state. So the bank's got 200 in assets. Not so big. 200 in assets, 150 in liabilities, $50 in equity. First thing to notice is our asset total starts off at 200. Liabilities plus equity, 150 plus 50 is also 200. So good so far, our balance sheet balances. It then sees one of its investments increase in value by $20. Okay. Oh, first, before we do that, let's think about the leverage ratio. If you remember, leverage ratio equals assets divided by equity. You can also think of as leverage ratio times equity equals assets. So we start off, our leverage ratio we said is 4 times our equity of 50 gets us to 200 in assets. And notice that's what we start off at. We start off with a leverage ratio of 4-to-1, 50 in equity, 200 in assets. Good there. Next step. Next thing that happens is one of our investments goes up by $20. So that takes us to plus 20. So now we have a total of 220 in assets. So on the right side of the balance sheet, if the left side goes up 20, the right side also needs to go up 20. And so notice our liabilities haven't changed. We didn't borrow any more money from anyone. It just happened that one of our investments went up in value. Well, that means that our bank becomes worth more. So we add $20 in equity. So now we have liability plus equity of 220. So the balance sheet balances again. So this is sort of where we are when the problem starts. Now what we have to think is, how is the bank going to respond? And one of the things we can think about is our equity is now equal to 70. Well, if we want to maintain our 4-to-1 leverage ratio, that means we need to make our assets. So we need it to be that our leverage ratio of 4 times our equity of 70 equals assets, which means we need assets to equal 280. So what is the bank going to do to get that to be the case? So we are going to now, in order to get to 280, we have 220 after our investments increase. We need to get our assets to 280. So that means we're going to have an extra we're going to add $60 to our assets. Essentially, we've decided that because our bank has gotten bigger, we're now comfortable growing our assets. So we're going to loan out an extra $60. So someone asked where 280 came from. It comes from the $70 in equity we now have times 4 to get us to our asset size, our target asset size of 280. So 70 times our 4-to-1 ratio means we want to have 280 in assets. Okay. So again, that's going to get us to 280 in assets. Well, in order for us to loan out an extra $60, we've got to get $60 from somewhere. We can't just decide we want our equity to go up. So instead, we have to borrow money. So we're going to add 60 over here. Notice now we now have 150 plus 60 plus $70 in liabilities plus equity, which is 280. So now we've done everything we set out to do. Our balance sheet balances and our leverage ratio stays at 4-to-1. We have 70 in equity times 4 leverage ratio of 4 gets us to 280 in assets. Next question. The Federal Reserve System regulates the money supply primarily by. Okay, so the answer here is B. The main tool that we use is what we call open market operations. Remember, open market operations are when the Fed is buying and selling bonds. Because when the Fed buys and sells bonds, what that means is the banks, when they buy and sell them, they're the currency used for buying and selling are US dollars. So when the Fed wants to get money out of the market, they sell bonds in exchange for US dollars. Okay. C, altering the reserve requirements of commercial banks. So that is one of the tools that the Fed has. It's just a tool they don't use very often because a lot of times banks aren't actually limited by this. So a lot of banks are not close to their reserve requirements. So if you tell a bank it has to go from 8% reserves to 10, but the bank was only at 5 anyway, it's not going to make a difference. So again, C is one of the tools that the Fed could use, but this is by far the most common. If this bank can make no more loans, what is the reserve ratio? The answer here is D. So what the reserve ratio is the fraction of deposits that must be kept on hand as reserves. And so what's going on here? If the bank can make no more loans, essentially what that means is it is loaned out the most money it's allowed to. Because if you remember, the Fed requires you to keep some cash on hand as a reserve. Remember, you think about reserves as the money that's in the vault. And so if we have 500 in deposits and we've kept 100 in reserves, that means we are keeping 1/5 of our deposits in reserve. So equals reserves over deposits, which here is 100 over 500, which is 1/5. As a reminder, equity, like I said, it's sort of what the bank is worth. One way to think about it is assets minus liabilities equals equity. So if we take all the stuff we've got, all the money, all the people who owe us money, if we take all of that and add it up, minus the liabilities, that's what we owe to other people. So all the money that's people have deposited, all the money that we've borrowed. If we take assets minus liabilities, that gets us to equity. All right, next question. If this bank can make no more loans, what is the money multiplier? So the money multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the reserve ratio. This is one of the first formulas we learned with multipliers. Think about what we can get out of this. Well, the one thing to notice is when the money multiplier is low, so when the money multiplier is small, reserve ratio is large. So they're inversely related. And so the reason that should make sense is, let's think about it. The reserve ratio is how much money the bank is required to keep in the vault. Well, the way the money multiplier works is by money being loaned and spent and deposited and loaned out again and spent again and deposited again and loaned out again. Well, when we force money, when the Fed says you actually have to keep most of this money in your vault, when the Fed requires you to keep a lot of money in your vault, that means that that's money that can't be loaned out and spent and deposited and loaned out again and spent again and deposited again. So when the reserve ratio is large, that means most of the money is being kept in the vault, or more of the money is being kept in the vault. When it's kept in the vault, it can't be loaned out. So when the reserve ratio is large, we're going to have a smaller money multiplier because we're not going to see money multiplied out as much because it's not being loaned and redeposited and reloaned out as much. Next, suppose a shock in the economy leads to a decrease in the demand for loanable funds. How does this impact the investment demanded? Okay, so this is one that's tripped up a lot of people. The answer here is A. We're going to get movement down and to the right on the demand curve. Let's see why that is. So this is just, so again, we move down and to the right. Here I just rewrote the question up there to give us more room down here. So this is the loanable funds market. So loanable funds is all the money that's out there available to be borrowed. So where does that money come from? Somebody's saving it. So if you think about it, you could be both a supplier and a demander of loanable funds. So if you're a supplier of loanable funds, that is when you deposit in the money in the bank, which makes it available for someone to borrow. Well, when the interest rate goes up, you're going to be more likely to save, right? So you're like, oh, I was going to spend that money or I was going to just hold on to it in my wallet. But since the interest rate's so high, now I will supply that. Now I'll put it in the market, which means when the interest rate went up, you increased your quantity supplied. The demand side is going to be the demand for loanable funds. So that is the amount of borrowing that occurs. Well, now if the interest rate goes up, you're going to be less likely to borrow, right? So when mortgage rates are really high, people are less likely to go buy a new house. Okay. So in the problem, what it tells us is there is a decrease in demand. So that means demand for loanable funds will shift to the left. So going from here to here. So what we can see from there is interest rate is going to go down, right? So interest rate decreases. So I think probably most of us got there successfully. The next thing we had to think about is how does this affect investment demand? Well, if you remember, the interest rate, the investment demand curve, just like any demand curve, is a relationship between price and quantity. And so for investment demand, the price of investing is the interest rate. We talked about that. So what that means is when the interest rate goes down, that's going to increase the quantity of borrowing that occurs, right? This is interest rate went down, so Michael bought 3 forklifts instead of 2 because that third forklift is now worth the expense of borrowing because the price of borrowing went down. Main thing to think about here is movement along the demand curve is what we get when price changes. Here, price is interest rate. A shift of the demand curve occurs when something other than price changes. Okay, so price changing means we have a change in interest rate, which is exactly what happens here. So the interest rate decreased, which means we have movement down and to the right on the investment demand curves. That's why we have movement down, because when the only thing that changes is interest rate, then we get movement along. When something other than the interest rate changes, that's when we would get movement of the curve. But since the only thing that we had happen here was a change in interest, that's going to be movement along the demand curve. Next one. Cuba maintains a fixed exchange rate and pegs its currency to the US dollar. Trade restrictions are lifted and Americans decided they want to buy more Cuban cigars. Which of the following represents an activity that the Cuban government would likely undertake to maintain their fixed exchange rate? Okay, pretty evenly split here. The answer here is B. Let's see why. So what I can think about is the supply and demand for pesos. So what that means is our y-axis is price of pesos. The x-axis is quantity of pesos. There's what it looks like initially. Trade restrictions are lifted. Americans decide they want to buy more Cuban cigars. So that is going to be an increase in the demand for pesos, right? Because if I want to buy a Cuban cigar, that is going, that is going to require me to acquire Cuban pesos, because when I buy the cigars, the people who are selling the cigars, they want to be paid in pesos. So we start here and go up to here. Now we need to think about what it means that there is a fixed exchange rate. Remember, the fixed exchange rate means that Cuba has decided that it wants its exchange rate to be here. So fixed. Well, when the exchange rate went from here up to here, now the exchange rate would be too high. So what Cuba needs to do is think about some way to get the exchange rate back to where it wants the exchange rate to be. And so what it's going to do is increase supply. So it needs to get supply to here, close enough, to get the fixed exchange rate back where it wants it to be. Okay, so I think hopefully we got that far, that demand increased, and so in order to get the fixed exchange rate where we want it, we need supply to increase as well. So next thing we'll do is I'll do that graph the little arrows that I like to do. So we have Cuba here, and the world is over here. And Cuba wants to increase the supply of pesos, right? They want supply to increase. That means Cuba needs to get pesos out into the world. And so they obviously could just, give them away to people or drop them out of the helicopter. Instead, what they're usually going to do is try to get something in return, which is often going to be U.S. currency, sometimes U.S. bonds. So maybe we got this far. Okay, the next step, and this is oftentimes the trickiest step, is turning this thing right here into words. And so we think about it is, if pesos are going from Cuba to the world, that means Cuba is selling them, right? So when I sell something, it's something that I used to have, someone else now has. So Cuba has sold pesos, and the way they did that was the world paid for them, the world bought them using US currency. So Cuba sold pesos using US currency, all right? Last one. Demand curve for British pounds in terms of US dollars. Which of these describes how it slopes and why? So, the answer here is D. Let's see why that is. So remember, what we want to think about is, why is it that the demand for currency slopes down? Well, this is going to be the price of pounds. It's going to be the quantity of pounds. Think about the price in dollars. And demand slopes down. And why is that? Well, what we think about is, first off, who are the demanders? The demanders of pounds are going to be Americans who are buying goods made in England. So we'll say that I'm buying a Rolls Royce. And the price, the exchange rate or the price of pounds goes down. So pounds get cheaper. Well, that means that I can buy more stuff, in more British made stuff with my dollars, right? So it used to be that, I would need $100,000 to buy the Rolls Royce. Now I only need $90,000 because that $90,000 can buy me more pounds because pounds got cheaper. So things denominated in pounds, so things that are sold in pounds, so things made in England, those get cheaper. Well, what that means is, if we started off here and then the price of pounds goes down, so I'm now able to buy, I can now afford that Rolls Royce, then what's going to happen is that I will increase the number of pounds I'm demanding. So the price goes down. So go back to remind ourselves of what the actual question and answer were. So it's downward sloping because a lower price of pounds means British goods are cheaper to Americans, right? Because the same number of dollars can get me more British pounds, which means it can get me more stuff. So get me, more cheddar cheese or Rolls Royces. Okay. which means that I am going to buy more British made goods. So I will increase my quantity demanded.